We'll start with a simple question, which is why do we need oxygen? If we start with a single cell organism, that cell obviously needs to do things. That includes moving things, making things, eating things. And that needs energy, which most of you know is ATP. Energy to make ATP comes from the combustion of food. So you're taking food, burning it with oxygen, producing carbon dioxide and water, and in that process you're converting ADP to ATP. You can then use that ATP to do all of these things. I'm sure most of you know you can also get ATP anaerobically by taking food, converting it to lactic acid. Some organisms do that their entire life. If we do that, we end up making lactic acid, which most of you know if you've done any intense exercise can leave you feeling somewhat miserable. So we try to get most of our energy by burning food with oxygen. A tiny bit more detail about how we're using the oxygen I've illustrated here, which shows how we can take free fatty acids from fat, convert them to acetyl-CoA. We can take glucose from stored glycogen, convert that to acetyl-CoA, and then you take the acetyl-CoA and stick it through the Krebs cycle. That's actually Hans Krebs sitting on I think it's a moped, so that's actually the Krebs cycle there. So when you do that, then you're going to get ATP out of the glucose and out of the fat. So in a single cell organism, that's happening all the time. It's taking the oxygen, burning it with food, getting the ATP. How does that single cell organism get the oxygen? So the oxygen is in the water around it, and it's simply diffusing in. So it's moving by diffusion. And what causes diffusion? Why does an oxygen molecule move from here to there? It has to move down a concentration or a pressure gradient. So that's basically what we're going to talk about a lot when we're looking at respiratory physiology, is pressure gradients that allow oxygen to move from one place to another. So we need to talk about pressure. In this room, or in your room, we're all in different rooms, but there's an atmospheric pressure, or which is all called the barometric pressure. So that's due to the movement and collision of gas molecules. So the best way that I can illustrate this is to get you guys to imagine a scenario where there's a dish filled with mercury, and then I've taken a container, turned it upside down, and stuck it into that dish, and created a complete vacuum. So there's absolutely nothing in here at all. It's called a vacuum. When you do that, mercury will move up into that vacuum. And if you ask somebody, why does the mercury move up into there? A lot of people tell you, well, it's sucked into there by the vacuum. That's not the right answer. The reason it moves in there is that on the surface of the mercury, all over here, the air molecules that are in the room are pounding on the surface, creating a force or a pressure, pushing down on the mercury there. So there's now a pressure in that mercury. Here, that's not happening. There's nothing pounding on that surface there, so there's no pressure pushing on that surface. So the mercury gets pushed up into that cylinder. So there's actually no such thing as sucking. If anybody ever tells you that you suck at something, tell them there's no such thing as sucking. You're just overly susceptible to atmospheric pressure. So that's what's going on in this room. Every surface in the room, every surface in your room is being pounded on by the different air molecules. And there's enough pressure created by those air molecules to move mercury 760 millimeters up an evacuated cylinder. Doesn't matter how big the cylinder is, how wide it is, how narrow it is, there's enough force to push mercury 760 millimeters up there. So that's why we say the barometric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. So Dalton, physicist, created the Dalton's law of partial pressures. He said the total pressure exerted by a mixture of gases is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of the individual gases. So in our rooms, there are several gases floating around, and I've illustrated them here as blue, red, and green. So in your room, my room, the blue gas accounts for about 598 millimeters of mercury. The red gas accounts for about 157 millimeters of mercury, and the green gas accounts for about 5 millimeters of mercury. and total is 760 millimeters of mercury. So you can break them down into percentages. So if the gas is in your room, 78% is one gas, 21% is another gas, and about 1 is another gas. So I'll give you a second to see if you can guess what those gases are. There's one that's very prevalent, one that's a lot less prevalent, one that's even less prevalent, and then there's a whole bunch of others that are virtually not there at all. So those are nitrogen, oxygen, and water. So a lot of you probably thought that one of these was carbon dioxide. There's so little carbon dioxide in the room that you're in, and the room that I'm in, that it's considered almost negligible. Nitrogen makes up most of it, oxygen makes up 21%, and water makes up variable amounts, roughly about 1%. So that's the partial pressure that each of those gases is exerting in the room. And Henry's law also says that when a gas is in contact with a liquid in which it's soluble, it will exert the same pressure in the liquid as it did in the air. So if this was water, oxygen in the air exerts a partial pressure of 160-ish millimeters of mercury. It will diffuse into the water, go into solution in the water, and even though it's in solution, it will still exert the same pressure in that water. So we can illustrate that on this slide. In the water around this single cell organism, oxygen is exerting a pressure of about 160 millimeters of mercury. Because the oxygen is being used up in the cell, by the cell itself, it's in a smaller concentration in the cell, and it's exerting less pressure in the cell. So what that means is that there's a pressure gradient. More pressure outside, less pressure inside, exerted by the oxygen, and oxygen will move into the cell down that pressure gradient. So life was very simple then. As the cell used more oxygen, the oxygen pressure in the cell would drop and more oxygen would come in. It could do whatever it wanted because there's a massive supply of oxygen around it in the water that it's swimming in. Life is very simple. It's more complicated for us. How do we get oxygen? We still have cells that need oxygen. So our job as an organism is to make sure that those cells are always surrounded by enough oxygen, exerting enough pressure that the cells can simply use oxygen and it will diffuse in down its partial pressure gradient. So to do that, we need to carry oxygen continuously to the cells. And we do that with a circulatory system. The circulatory system has capillaries in every tissue bed, so every cell in your body is bathed in oxygen. That liquid in that circulatory system needs to be capable of carrying oxygen. If you just have water in there, you can't fit a whole lot of oxygen into water. So the circulatory system is filled with blood, which contains hemoglobin, which is very good at carrying oxygen down to the cells. That blood supply needs to be exposed to an interface where it's constantly seeing fresh air. So we're bringing fresh air in from outside, and the oxygen can diffuse into the blood at this end, carried with the hemoglobin, and diffuse out at that end. You need to ventilate the air supply there. So you need to have a rib cage and muscles of breathing that are moving air in and out of that alveoli, bringing fresh air in to get taken up by circulation. And you need to control everything to keep it efficient. So you guys could all be sitting there breathing as hard as you could all the time, guaranteeing that you're getting enough oxygen down in here to meet your metabolic needs. But that'd be exhausting. So you have a control system in your pons and brainstem. Looks vaguely like a pons and brainstem. So they control everything so that you're breathing just enough to keep these cells happy. So what we'll do in the session today is I'm going to go through different aspects of the physiology of getting oxygen down to the cells. We'll start with a bit of functional anatomy. Then we'll look at the mechanics of breathing, how you generate forces to move air in and out of the alveoli. Then we'll look at the actual gas pressures, the partial pressures of gases in the alveoli, and how we achieve the pressures that we need to make sure that diffusion into circulation is taking place. We'll call that alveolar gas exchange. We'll look at how the body's really good at making sure that the air in the blood goes to the same place. It's in this diagram I've shown one alveoli and one capillary bed, but there's many alveoli and many capillary bed. And you need to have a system to make sure that the air is going to one place and that the circulation is going to that same place in your lung. We'll look at how we carry oxygen in the blood, how hemoglobin works to make sure you're carrying a ton of oxygen down to the metabolic cells. Look a little bit at circulation, and we'll look at control, how you control everything to make sure you keep it efficient.